Okay, so let's talk about the next group of tissues called connective tissue. And as the term implies, it's really tissue that is in between the other tissues, right? So it's what's holding us together. It's what's holding different parts of the body together. So connective tissue proper can be broken down into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. So the loose connective tissue would be, for example, your subcutaneous tissue, which is looser. It still has collagen in it and it still has elastic fibers in it, but it's just looser. Okay. Your dense connective tissues would be along the lines of tendons and ligaments, and they're still made of collagen, but they're much more firm, and the collagen fibers are aligned in a linear fashion. Okay, so just think of connective tissue is really what's holding. If you would look at your arm, for example, uh, below the skin is your connective tissue before you actually get to the muscle bundles, say, in your lower arm. Okay, that's all connective tissue. When other types of connective tissue that are included are cartilage. Okay, well, cartilage of, say, in a joint, which is hyaline cartilage. Say your knee joint has hyaline cartilage in it. Elastic cartilage, say in your ear. It's very bendable. It's cartilage, but it's still connective tissue. And then finally, fibrocartilage. That would be cartilage that is producing your, say, the discs between your vertebra is made of very powerful fibrocartilage, or the cartilage holding your pelvis together in the front is made of fibrocartilage. So it's just it's typically not mobile cartilage like in a joint, but it's fixing two bones together, but it's still cartilage. Okay, so I would think of the intervertebral discs of your spine as a very, very strong fibrocartilage. Okay, bone is a connective tissue. Okay, that's included, and that kind of makes sense. Bone is connecting many parts of us, right? And the bone is held together by ligaments. So ligaments are connective tissue. And blood is also considered connective tissue, right? So the blood components and the plasma, which is the liquid part of the blood. So when we say blood components, I'm referring to the cells of the blood, and we'll talk about those later. And then the plasma component of the blood, which is the liquid component of the blood, is considered connective tissue. Okay, so here's some examples of connective tissue, right? Loose connective tissue in the top left there, which will be your subcutaneous tissue. It'll have collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So if you were to pull on your skin, it'll reset itself. It'll rebound back. That's because it has elastic fibers in it. You'll have fibrous connective tissue, which is, say, your tendons or ligaments, and they're typically very powerful and able to endure a lot of tension from the muscle contractions. Okay, cartilage, as I mentioned, is a form of connective tissue. Adipose tissue, which is in the subcutaneous like below the skin. There's adipose tissue, that's connective tissue, bone itself, and blood that we discussed. Okay, so if you look at the slide above this and this one, I think it'll make sense what connective tissue is. Okay, so loose connective tissue, just to go on a bit more about it. So it's going to have adipose tissue with it, right? So it's a good storage of energy in the form of fatty acids. And it fills spaces between organs. And it fills out tissues such as your legs, your arms, your chest, and it holds organs in place. It can act as a protective cushion to injury. So if we fall, there's loose connective tissue to pad us a bit. It gives us shape and form, and also provides insulation to regulate heat and to stop the cold from getting in. Okay, so dense connective tissue. This is typically, I think, of tendons and ligaments. So tendons are what attaches a muscle to a bone to allow the muscle, when the muscle contracts, the tendon gets pulled on and then it moves the bone. Okay, so if you were to make a muscle or flex your arm, you're actually contracting your biceps muscle. You're pulling on the biceps tendon, which is then moving the bone. Okay, ligaments attach bone to bone, and these are examples of dense connective tissue, and they're typically made of collagen, which is produced by fibroblasts. Okay, so and if you look at the image below, look how linear the image on the left is, right? That's going to be a ligament or a tendon. The fibers are very linear. Some of our organs have capsules around them to really hold them in place. The heart is an example that it has a very, very strong capsule around it called the pericardium. And it really is a protective lining that not only holds the heart in place while it's contracting, but it's extremely protective to the heart as well, okay, in case of an injury to the chest. The skin has dense connective tissue as well. Okay, so the skin isn't really that loose. It can be sometimes, but dense connective tissue is also found in the skin. And remember, when we're talking about connective tissue, we're often referring to collagen as an important molecule produced by fibroblasts, and elastin, which gives elasticity to the connective tissue. So here's an example of different areas where cartilage exists. And cartilage is a connective tissue. So you're going to have cartilage in your nose, in your external ear, which tends to be very elastic cartilage. In your joints, you'll often have hyaline cartilage, which is what we call synovial cartilage, which is lining many of your joints. And even in your knee, you have hyaline cartilage. So I know you're seeing it as red there, but on top of the cartilage, you have these very, very strong, dense cartilage called the menisci, or the meniscus of the knee. And we'll talk about that when we're talking about the knee joint. And that's why it's listing it here as fibrocartilage. Okay, so if you look at the airway, the epiglottis, the larynx, the trachea, the rings of the trachea, the bronchial tubes, they're hyaline cartilage. So they're pretty firm, but there is some flexibility to them. Not as much as flexibility as in the ear or in the nose. Okay, so these are just examples of where you're going to find cartilage. I mentioned fibrocartilage existing at the front of the pubic bone, which holds the two sides of the pelvis together. That's very dense fibrocartilage. Okay, but in general, in the joints, you're going to find hyaline cartilage. That's the most common in the joints, such as the knee, the elbow, the shoulder. Okay. Okay, let's talk about bone as a connective tissue. So when we're talking about bone, it gives a lot of structure to the body, right? It gives internal support to the body. It stores vast amounts of calcium and phosphate. I think around 98% of your calcium stores are in your bones. Okay, bones provide a lot of protection. Your ribs, for example, they protect your chest, right? Your lungs and your heart from impact. And they go down a bit lower and have a bit of protection of your liver, and of course bones surround your brain, right? The skull surrounds the brain, so they provide protection to different areas of the body. They give support to the body. They allow the body to move, right? The muscles that attach to tendons that then attach to bones allow movement of the body. Okay, so with this, and now the bone the other function that we didn't mention here is that bone produces all the cells of your blood, right, in the bone marrow. So that's an important function of bone as well. So your white blood cells, your red blood cells, and your platelets are all produced in bone marrow. Okay, what kind of bones do we have? Well, typically the outer layer of long bones, such as your femur or your tibia, or the radius and ulna of your arm or your forearm, the outer part is compact bone, right? It's solid, it's very rigid, and it's made up of little components, and we'll get into this later in another module, of osteons. Those are bone complexes that make up compact bone. Spongy bone, or another term for it is cancellous bone, is like a matrix, right? It's got all kinds of little areas to it, little holes to go into, and it's an inner matrix within the compact bone, and we call it a trabecular network, and that's where bone marrow would exist, and that's where bone cells, or white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets would be produced. Okay, so compact bone and cancellous or spongy bone. Okay, so here we are talking about the blood now. So I mentioned that blood cells are typically white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, and they all are in a fluid matrix called plasma. Okay, so they're floating in so we have about 5 liters of blood within us, and these cells are floating within the 5 liters. Now, about 40% of that 5 liters is purely red blood cells. Okay, so that's why your blood is so red, because it's packed with red blood cells for carrying oxygen. Okay, white blood cells make up a tiny percentage of your total blood volume. About 1% of your total blood volume, And the platelets, even less. Okay, the platelets are these tiny little cells for clotting that we'll talk about in more detail in another module. The white blood cells are part of your immune system for protection against infections. And then the red blood cells, which make up, as I mentioned, about 40% of your blood volume, make up a huge proportion. So those are the cells of the blood. The plasma carries an assortment of things, including proteins, and an assortment of other components that we'll get to in another module. What's the function of the blood? Well, transport of respiratory gases. Well, oxygen binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells. CO2, carbon dioxide, is in the plasma, waiting to get to the lungs to be to diffuse into the alveoli of the lungs and to be breathed out, right? CO2 is a waste product of cellular metabolism. The blood carries waste products to get them to the kidneys to be excreted. It carries nutrients such as glucose. It transports all kinds of proteins around the body. The immune response is the white blood cells and antibodies that we'll talk about. The blood is responsible for clotting, and we'll go into a lot of detail about clotting in another module. Okay, and all of this is contained within a closed system, right? So it's the arteries that go to smaller vessels called arterioles, that go to even smaller vessels called capillaries, that feed all the different cells of the body, all the vascular beds, we call them capillaries. And then finally they become little veins called venules, and they flow into bigger veins until finally the veins flow back to the heart, right? The blood flows back through the heart, gets oxygenated in the lungs, goes back to the heart and gets pumped out again. So the blood is a closed system. The 5 liters is contained within a vascular system. And hopefully we don't get a leak, because we don't like getting leaks. That means you're hemorrhaging somewhere, right? So if you get a leak in your gastrointestinal system, then you have a GI bleed. So under normal conditions, the blood or the vascular system is a closed system.